A successful attack, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Jordanians, even the Syrians, or some Syrians, would be delighted. But as I said, it's not something we should do, or certainly not soon. Guy in the back has had his hand up from the beginning, right?
Can you talk loud, though? Please speak loud.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm very interested in hearing you speak on this subject, especially because your book, Obligations, and your writing on just war has informed a lot of, I'm Israeli, a lot of Israeli thinking, especially among those who conscientiously object to service in the territories. So I'm happy to hear, that you, like Dershowitz, have always been against the settlements. But also, I find it curious that you think that boycotting is such a morally unacceptable stance in this case. And the reason I say that is, first of all, I agree that boycotting was not part of the Vietnamese or Algerian, opposition to those wars, which you consider unjust. But it certainly was part of the resistance to the South African apartheid state, which you participated in. And for people like you who are so opposed to settlements and so opposed to patently legal confiscations of land, Messianic Zionism, there's really a question of what should be done, right? Because even if you just want to start the clock at 1967, that was already 43 years ago, and very little has changed. So that's except that huge portions of the West Bank that were not previously settled by Jews are now settled, and that in Israel we've developed a status quo about those territories being part of Israel that we didn't previously have. So now you have the University of YIISA, which you can just drive to from Tel Aviv without even ever noticing that you've left what was once the borders of the state of Israel. So after 43 years and counting of this, where the situation only seems to become more and more intractable, and where the Israeli consensus certainly doesn't seem to be moving towards anything but talk, is it inappropriate for people who are concerned about this to non-violently ask that they withdraw their financial support from something that seems to them to be completely immoral?
Insofar as this is a statement of opposition to the occupation,
Absolutely.
and not to the existence of the state of Israel. I think it is. It's an entirely legitimate political position. It's not my position. I think there are other and better ways of fighting. And I think you will find that most of your allies don't share what you just said, that you are committed to the existence of the state of Israel. So there's a strategic question of who you work with in opposing the occupation. And are you prepared to work with people whose goal is the destruction of the state?
But isn't that question the same for you two sitting at that table, where one of you constantly apparently is accused of being in bed with neocons, but seems very eager to at least explore the bombing of Iran, whereas you don't appear to. But clearly, any sort of coalition revolving around a shared concern, it is abundantly clear to me that the boycott movement is full of insane people, mushy-headed liberals without question, who would never exist in a country that they support so greatly, and just plain anti-Semites and racists. But why should that be legitimate? What is legitimate criticism of a 43-year-long?
Well, if you were contemplating an alliance with neocons or with old-fashioned conservatives, or with I don't know where you stand. If you are a libertarian with social democrats, you are forming alliances within a spectrum of decency. And if you form alliances with anti-Semites and with people who are committed to the elimination of the state of Israel, then you are forming alliances with indecency. And there have to be limits in political life.
And just if I may, just as a footnote, I said, I think morally, I of course believe that Israel has the right to defend itself, and I think the West and other people should stop the regime doing what it it's very clearly out to do since its inception, since Ayatollah Khomeini wrote about this in the 70s. So I think there's a moral obligation to stop the destruction of the State of Israel from the Iranian regime and others who wish to do it. And in terms of connections to neocons, I was just referring to the fact that people who are defending Israel in this sense, say against the Iranian regime or other foes, or speaking to anti-Semitism in a very direct way and looking at the demonization and delegitimization of Israel by, say, Iran or others, and defending against that or speaking out against that, were labeled as neocons and the like. So it's sort of a, in the academy, a pigeonholing or even dehumanization of people who are really engaged in the study of contemporary anti-Semitism.
I'm just curious if the emergence, if it has the emergence of groups like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah led to any evolution in your own ideas and theories about just warfare, and if so, how?
I'm afraid that I'm boringly consistent. I think the original principles of just war theory, the structure of just war theory can be applied usefully to the fight against terrorist groups or groups of militants who use civilian cover. That's not entirely new in military history. In fact, if you think about siege warfare, the besieged army that holds up in a city is using civilian cover. And the besieging army, which cuts off food and water to the city, is putting civilians at risk. And the issues, those issues have been discussed for a very, very long time. The United States in Vietnam had to figure out how to fight against Viet Cong guerrillas who fired at them from villages in which people were living. And we sometimes responded very badly to those situations, and we have continued to do that in Afghanistan. There is a standard military response when you take fire from a village or a building. The standard military response is to pull back the infantry and call for the Air Force. Bomb the village, destroy the building. And that is a way of guaranteeing that large numbers of civilians will be killed. And now we now encounter fighters who are looking for that result because it strengthens them politically. They use civilian cover not because, well, they use civilian cover, some of them, thinking that you won't attack them because they have civilian cover, and others hoping that you will attack them and kill a lot of civilians, because that strengthens their political voice. So just war theory has an answer to those questions, a moral answer. It's not precise, and it doesn't tell you what to do in an actual battlefield situation. It's designed to shape the sensibility of the soldiers. And the argument is soldiers must accept risks for themselves in order to reduce the risks they impose on civilians. And they must do that even when the civilians are being used by militants or terrorists. Now, what degree of risk, how much risk, those are impossible questions for a philosopher. They are questions that get answered on the battlefield. But I think those questions are, they are questions that have arisen before in different forms in the arguments about just and unjust wars, and I don't think Hezbollah or the Taliban really change the way we should think about those questions.
There were three sort of models of liberal democracies that I've noticed. One is in places like India, where different religious groups are subject to a different sort of civil code. So Hindus and Muslims on issues like marriage or succession. And the second is in places like Israel, where the state clearly associates itself with a certain religion, but people are nonetheless have the freedom to practice any religion that they want. And the third is, let's say France, or let's say the US, where the state doesn't associate itself clearly with any religion. And again, people are free to practice what they want. So I was just wondering which one of these three you'd find sort of the most problematic or preferable, and why. And I'd also like to just sort of, as a footnote, say that the personal law system in India isn't a source of religious tension. India has enormous religious tension, like any religiously diverse sort of country of that magnitude would. But its source isn't, I mean, the personal law system is a very minor aspect of that. By and large, people are very happy with that. So.
But I think you may have misdescribed the Israeli case, which in Israel, family law is in the hands of religious courts, Christian, Muslim, Jewish. There is no civil marriage, for example. So there are three different sets of, maybe more, since Christianity is a.
And Druze. Right, no, but on your second point, was that the country clearly identifies itself with a certain religion, which India and the US.
Well, that's a problem in Israel, and it's also a question about Israel. The Jews are peculiarly, at one and the same time, a nation, a people, and a religious community. We have this double identity, which, and the two identities are entangled because we didn't have a state for so many years, for 2,000 years, we didn't have a state, and we weren't able to fight out the arguments about how you to separate state and religion. So the Jews have this double identity. But the state of Israel should be the expression of the national identity of the Jewish people and not of the religious identity. It should not be, in any sense, a Jewish state religiously. It should be a Jewish state nationally, in the same way that Norway is a Norwegian state nationally. Yeah, let me just use the Norwegian example for a minute. In 1903, Norway seceded from the Swedish Empire. And it seceded because the Norwegians were worried that they were losing their language and that their children were losing any sense of the history of Norway. They seceded to preserve Norwegianness. And the Norwegian state is a little engine for the reproduction of Norwegianness. That's what it is. And no one in the world objects to this. Maybe the Lapps in Lapland object to it, and maybe Macedonian immigrants to Norway find it uncomfortable. But by and large, no one objects to it. Now, Israel, in principle, should be a nation-state of that sort. And the religion should be, whether they have separate court systems as in India, or whether there is a civil system and then only voluntary jurisdictions for the religious communities, which we have here. A Jew can go to a Bet Din, to a Jewish court here, if both sides agree, and it's entirely voluntary. It's like arbitration, but there is no legal recognition of a Jewish court system here. Israel could take either of those forms. It could be like Norway, it could be like India, but it shouldn't be a state defined by religion. It shouldn't be at all a state defined by religion, and its founders insisted that it wouldn't be. The founding documents of Israel insist on its secularism.
What do you feel about the personal law system as compared with the uniform civil code?
I don't think we have to decide. If there is a history of, as in India or as in the Ottoman Empire, if there is a history of separate jurisdictions for religious communities with regard to family law, I don't think it's necessarily wrong. I don't think all countries have to be like the United States.
You mentioned the Crusades and the Jihad, so similar in many respects. We know something about the objectives of the Crusades. What do you think is the objective of the Jihad? Is it just to get us out of Muslim lands, or is it to create a worldwide caliphate? Why do you think they hate us?
Well, I think there is the hatred that Bruce Ackerman described, which is focused on the presence of Western troops on Arab lands, in Islamic, now in Afghanistan, in non-Arab, in Islamic countries. But I suspect that there is a mix of motives here. I don't think jihadism is an absolutely singular ideology. It takes different forms among Shiites and Sunnis, and it probably takes different forms within both of those religious groupings. There is an ambition which Al-Qaeda represents to recreate the caliphate over all the lands that were ever Islamic lands. But I also think there is, in some of these groups, a hatred of infidels and possibly of heretics also, of Muslims who have moved away from the true faith. I think of myself as theologically tone deaf, so I'm not very good at figuring out the motives of people who are driven by one or another version of theology.
We have time for one more question. Edith Shalom.
So, Goldstone was here yesterday.
Talk up.
Goldstone was here yesterday, and one thing that he claimed is that, we all know that Israel was accused in lack of proportionality, lack of proportion to, the response is not proportional. And what you said before, your answer to Michelle, you described the procedure that needs to be done before attacking civilians. So, to my knowledge, that was done in the Gaza war. And because I'm a psychologist, the concept of proportion, I'm a little bit confused. How is it measured? How can you make the proportion given the fact that it's not like two people fighting one another, it's like a state against terrorists. So my question is how your theories could be used. First, what is your attitude towards the Goldstone report? Just interesting in general if you have. And then how your theories could be used, or what arguments could be used out of your theories to analyze the report or to look at it.
I've read only the executive summary, 35 pages of the 600 pages of the Goldstone report. I've also read Moshe Halbertal's critique of the Goldstone report in the New Republic, which I thought was very, very persuasive, and which led me to think I didn't have to read the whole report, which may not be the right response, but I do want to talk about proportionality because it's a very important part of current, it figures very largely in current debates. And it has been a feature of just war theory pretty much since the beginning. I was, in Just and Unjust Wars and in other writings, I've been critical of the doctrine of proportionality because its standard use over time, its historical use, has been to justify too much. And let me give you an example of how it has historically been used, because it's now being used in a very different way. But historically, think of World War II. My best examples come from World War II because I grew up reading the newspapers during World War II. The Allies are bombing a German tank factory, which is located in a working class neighborhood. It wasn't put there for civilian cover. That's where it was. That's where factories were built in Germany in the 20s and 30s. Now, the tank factory is a legitimate military target. Given the aiming devices available in 1943, it was certain that if you aimed at the factory, a significant number of your bombs were going to hit the working class residences around the factory. You could predict with some probability how many civilians would be killed. And the proportionality argument was used to say, look, this factory is, tanks are rolling off the assembly line. These are deadly weapons. They are doing great damage in North Africa or wherever. And so you can justify a very large number of civilian deaths using the proportionality rule. You can say 1,000 civilian deaths is not disproportionate to the value of stopping the tanks that are rolling off this factory. And who can argue with that? Because how do you know? I mean, what damage those tanks might do? And that's the way the argument was historically used, and people like me felt that argument had to be criticized. And one way of criticizing it was to focus on the question, what are you doing to minimize the number of deaths? Now, the higher you fly in 1943, the more civilians you're going to kill because your bombs, your aiming will be less accurate. But the more planes will return safely because the anti-aircraft fire will also be less accurate. The lower you fly, the more likely you are to hit the factory, and the fewer civilians you will kill, and the more of your planes will be shot down. So you have to think about where between the highest and the lowest possible altitudes, where would you, and that's a moral, it's a strategic but also a moral argument. And it's much more serious argument than the proportionality argument because it challenges the attacking force to think seriously about what it can do and what risks it should accept in order to minimize risks to civilians. And that's the way I would like to think about incidents in Lebanon and in Gaza. And to think that way, you have to talk to the soldiers. You have to, and to the people on both sides. You have to figure out what the actual shape of the battle was like, and what kinds of decisions soldiers on the ground had to make. And Goldstone, I think, had no they use the new proportionality rule, which is that any number of civilians killed is disproportionate to the value of destroying the target. That's the new proportionality rule. It's as bad as the old one. It's a functional pacifist rule. It has the effect of making it impossible to attack, just as the old use of proportionality made it possible to kill far more people than should have been killed.
Well, to Bill Moyers, Goldstone said it was okay to do the targeted assassinations and implied even the drone attacks were okay. So he wasn't entirely a pacifist in his approach.
Right, okay. Yeah, targeted killings, if the target is a legitimate military target, and if there is real precision, seem to me to be justified.
Follow-up?
So,
One follow-up?
okay, one follow-up.
I'm a little new to the study of anti-Semitism, and I've heard you express your concern at the number of people among academics and leaders who desire the elimination of the state of Israel. There were protesters yesterday at Justice Goldstone's speech who respectfully put up a banner equating his report with the Dreyfus Affair and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. How would you respond to those protesters? Do you believe that Justice Goldstone was motivated by anti-Semitism?
No. No. I can't speak to his motivation. I find it puzzling that he accepted the chairmanship of a commission of 3 or 4 people, one of whom had already condemned Israel's conduct of the war before the commission had even had a meeting. I find that puzzling, but it's not anti-Semitism. It may be naivete. It may be a desire for fame. I don't know what motivates people politically. I think if Moshe Halbertol's critique is right, as I said, I found it persuasive. It's just a very bad report. They didn't do their work. But I'll just give one example, because it's a glaring example, which Moshe Halbertol told to me, but it wasn't in his review. They examined some 30-some incidents in which Israelis were accused of war crimes. They didn't notice that almost all of those incidents related to one unit in one place. They then wrote a report that was a general indictment of the whole conduct of the Israeli army, without noticing that the charges related only to one unit. They didn't recognize that that must mean that all the other units were fighting in a way that nobody could accuse them of any crime. Now that's, I don't know how a systematic report based on months of work could miss something like that.
So unfortunately, I know there's a few people who have questions. We have to leave the room. So first of all, thank you very much. It's a great honor that you were here with us. Thank you. We're grateful that you were here. And also just a short announcement. At 7:30 this evening, Yuli Edelstein, who is the Minister of Diaspora Affairs of Israel, will be here. And he's speaking on issues of demonization, delegitimization of Israel, and including addressing the Goldstone report. It will be 7:30 in this room. So thank you very much for coming. And thank you.